The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. In a moment, I'll pass you over to our presenters, Clive and Andrew. We're aiming for this webinar to be 30 minutes with a Q&A session, but if we do run over, we'll be sending the full recording in a few days for you to listen on demand. Please ask your questions via the chat box and we'll answer these at the end. I'll now pass you over to Clive and Andrew.
Hi, good afternoon. I hope you can all hear us. It's Andrew Street speaking here, and I've also got my friend.
Hello, I'm Clive Corcoran. So together we're going to present this webinar to you.
We're sitting here in our office here at IFF right in the middle of West London, and I can tell you it's a steamy hot afternoon. We're not used to these high temperatures, so do forgive us if we start to melt a little. We've had to turn the air conditioning off to keep the noise down, so things are starting to heat up. What are we going to cover today? Well, we're going to be talking about operational risk. What is it? What are the characteristics of it? The magnitude of these things, how big they can be, how frequently they can occur. We've got a few case studies, in particular talk about TSB and Standard Chartered. TSB is quite timely. They just reported results today for their second quarter, which I'm afraid weren't very good. We'll also talk about operational risk toolkits. What sorts of things can we apply to actually reduce and manage operational risk. We'll also talk about how that might impact reputation risk, which is obviously a big knock-on effect of an operational risk failure. We'll also talk about rogue trading and look at the magnitude of operational losses that have occurred in the past, so examples as it were. And then we'll talk in some more detail about how we can mitigate these things, how can we reduce the losses for operational risk, how can we reduce the frequency of operational risk problems. And we'll talk a little bit about internal controls and also external controls, and most importantly, probably of this webinar, really corporate governance, how corporate governance can greatly affect the amount of OR that we actually have, and also look at a little bit of risk culture and how risk culture affects the way that we actually manage operational risk. To the next slide, what is operational risk? Well, OR is a massive area, as I'm sure a lot of you appreciate. It covers a very wide range of events which lead to losses in a business. So these can range from things like rogue traders, effectively betting the firm's capital and losing it, as it were. Nick Leeson, springs to mind on that one, or IT errors to fires or terrorist actions. Generally speaking, we can sort of associate operational risk with mistakes by people, either directly or through errors in planning or software. The good old Basel Committee, of course, responsible for so much in terms of banking regulation, have defined different types of OR for financial institutions, and indeed within the framework of Basel II and Basel III, there's extensive information and requirements with regard to OR. And in general, when we talk about risk, we're talking about a frequency, how often something occurs, and also a severity or an impact of that event. So obviously things that are very high frequency with high impact, cannot be accepted, as it were, in a business. We'd be out of business very quickly if we did. So risk, therefore, is forward-looking. It's about what happens in the future, and it's got an eye, obviously, to the frequency and severity of those things as they occur. And we have this idea of a normal range of risk events, so relatively small, frequent things that happen, small errors, keying errors, for example, right the way through to the tail risks, which we often call black swans, due to my good friend Nassim Taleb. Again, those very, very rare events that happen very, very infrequently. So, Clive, maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of OR.
Yes, I will. So one of the distinctions that sometimes can be made regarding operational risk is that to use this distinction, which those of you who've ever studied any macroeconomics will be very familiar with this distinction between endogenous and exogenous. I think the claim can be made that operational risk is not usually, or can be sometimes, but not usually the result of some kind of exogenous shock. So some kind of shock that comes from outside the system, or maybe in terms of, say, looking at the financial crisis, one might want to sort of thereby think that that was the result of an exogenous shock. When we say it's more likely to arise endogenously, we're saying that it's more likely to be just the result of or an unintended consequence of business as usual, as it were. So that, I think, is an important distinction to make. The other key point that I'd like to make in that context is that operational risk is often very positively correlated to, say, the complexity of operations. So the more complex and sophisticated your business processes are, the more likely and vulnerable you are to operational failure. So in carrying on with that sort of first point I made, a characteristic then is that incidence and severity of operational risk is often unrelated to other types of risks, say, which are more based on, say, macroeconomic business cycles. And of course, the final point I'd like to make on that slide is that in principle, at least, you could argue that operational risk is essentially controllable ex ante, that the better your systems to identify a potential operational failure, the better they work, the more likely you are to avoid operational failures and thereby the costs associated with them. So if I might move on now to the next slide, we'll talk about the magnitude, and Andrew touched on this a moment ago, but we can also characterize operational losses according to maybe this distinction: high frequency, low severity. So a number of operational failures like minor fraud, minor processing losses, IT glitches, these occur frequently, but very often don't result in substantial losses to a bank. More of concern to a bank, or for that matter any enterprise actually, would be the kind of losses which are much less frequent, but when they do happen, they're often associated with major losses. And various things come to mind, such as, Andrew mentioned this already, rogue trading, and we'll give an example later on of a rogue trading incident, and also criminal misconduct. In fact, we'll come on to this in a moment, but you'll see, if those of you who are not familiar with this, that somewhere in the region of $300 billion plus has been incurred in the form of actual losses, fines, class action lawsuits by the major banks around the world just in the last 10 years. So indeed, this is an important area of operational failure.
Okay, so let's just think about some recent examples then, just to put some flesh on the bones. I mean, TSB, unfortunately, comes to mind for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. TSB's Trustees Savings Bank, which was spun off from Lloyds Bank a few years ago and sold to Sabadell. And recently, as April this year, they tried to implement a big IT upgrade to their online banking systems. And as some of you well know, it didn't work very well. And in fact, they're still in the midst of trying to clear up the mess from the failure of the upgrade. They announced results today for Q2. They were actually minus 107 million. I think that's correct, compared with sort of plus 100 million, for a similar period last year. So, notwithstanding the compensation and other costs involved, they probably down in terms of revenue by a couple of 100 million over this quarter compared with the quarter last year. So, clearly there's large amounts of money involved there. Now, I mean, very quickly, I mean, what sorts of things are we talking about here? Well, it's basically an online banking system, which when it was upgraded meant that people were unable to access their accounts, or they were able to see other people's accounts, or there were various other failures which led to a plethora of frauds and scammers coming in, basically allegedly to help people, but effectively just using it as a way of stealing their money. Needless to say, there's an enormous amount of reputational damage as a result of this. Now, some of the things you might say is, well, what could they have done to have prevented this? Well, this is a good example, I think, where they've got a very major project here, with a failure of which is obviously very, very negative in terms of the reputation and obviously the profitability of the firm. I mean, the bottom line is that these sorts of IT upgrades need to be managed extremely carefully. And indeed, this is a classic example where the thing needs to be staged from a development cycle through a production cycle, where there's a limited release, where there's testing, perhaps with a small group of nominated and rewarded customers, so that it can operate in a kind of pseudo-live environment before the thing actually goes fully live across the system. Again, I don't know too many details about exactly what testing was done, but there seemed to be quite a lot of reliance on IBM, for example, as a third party in terms of verification of the system implementation. But again, I'm not aware exactly what those details were. But of course, for TSB, outsourcing this kind of thing, has its risks, because ultimately the failure, of course, is catastrophic for the reputation of the firm, if not from a monetary perspective. So it begs the question about what external warranties are worth, how much testing internally has been done, whether or not a limited release of the IT upgrade was run in a production environment to see if there were any other problems, and indeed a whole plethora of management around implementation of major IT upgrades. Again, this is a whole area which in the future and as much as today is becoming increasingly important. We live in an age which is a technological age, and the platforms that we use and the software that we use effectively are the business. So major changes to the business like that are indeed to be managed exceptionally carefully. If we go on to the next example, which is Standard Chartered, this is to do with sanctions busting and money laundering. In essence, what this is actually providing banking services for people who you shouldn't provide banking services to. So if you're on a sanctions list, for example, you're not allowed to move the money from the people who are being sanctioned to other people. If the US government is the person putting those sanctions in place and you're dealing in dollars, then the US government can make life very difficult for you indeed if you breach their sanctions in terms of being able to deal in their currency. And indeed, in terms of money laundering, again, if you move money around for the bad guys and the good guys spot that, then again, you're going to be in trouble. Now, obviously, a lot of this is to do with knowing your customer, knowing who the transaction is for, knowing who the counterparties are in that transaction, and being sure that the transaction is actually legitimate and there is no relationship, if you like, to people who are potentially on the wrong list. Now, again, in terms of how could we help to prevent this, certainly things like artificial intelligence, for example, or other types of systems which scan for known names and also which scan the web, for example, for connections between names or institutions and people who may or may not be on the sanctioned list, is one of the ways of trying to prevent these kinds of situations. And again, we can talk more about this in the future, but again, the idea is to catch that before the action actually happens. I mean, in essence, it all comes down to knowing your customer and what the customer is actually doing. In Standard Charter's case, just to as a bit of redemption, they did actually notice, in fact, that they had actually breached the rules, and they, in fact, reported themselves to the regulator in this particular instance. It's just a pity that they hadn't actually flagged up this situation beforehand. I mean, just to give you a flavour of what sorts of things were happening here, this is where money was being moved from different accounts across borders. It seems the people who were moving the money were moving millions of dollars. It seemed the people who allegedly were the owners of the money had, basically visible incomes of only tens of thousands of dollars. So you had a situation here where there were people who were connected to either the military or the controlling government effectively in one country, and the inference is effectively that the money was dirty, and therefore Standard Chartered should not have been helping them to move that money around or indeed to launder that money. So both of those situations, whether it's the IT failure or whether it's the money laundering type failure, obviously have a huge impact on reputation. Reputation risk is often one of the biggest casualties of an OR event. It's not just the money you have to pay in compensation or the time and effort repairing the damage. Once the reputation of the firm has been solid, it's actually very difficult to win back. And indeed, what this does is it leads to a decline in confidence and a loss of business and future revenue streams. And that can be even worse actually than the actual losses themselves and the regulatory fine itself. So things like public relations, basically saying sorry, admitting the problem, basically giving details as to how that problem is not going to happen again in the future, accepting that you've inconvenienced people and compensating people for that inconvenience, that's all one of those ways of actually rebuilding reputational risk. I think, Clive, now if you want to talk about the impact of that in terms of the fines and things that we've seen from these sorts of situations.
Yes, well, and as Andrew's gone through a couple of sort of specific case studies there, but if we sort of move out to the sort of macro level, the high level, and look at, go into a little bit more detail on what I mentioned a while ago, which is the just the severity of fines and losses that have arisen, say, even we take the US banks. This excerpt here from the Financial Times gives you sort of a timeline of some of the bigger incidents that have happened here. As you can see, this comes from last year, but I'll even show you something that's a bit more up to date in a moment. But the $150 billion has been paid out by the US banks, and that's just the US banks. You include the European, and as I say, it comes up to about $300 billion. For example, I'll look at one here on November in 2013. JP Morgan paid out $13 billion in settlements in a single day over a mis-selling or misrepresentation of the risk associated with mortgage-backed securities, and there's some other things along that timeline there, all of which are contributing towards what you'll see on the next slide. So this slide basically is more up to date even than that. It comes from Boston Consulting Group, and if you look at the two the graphics, the left and the right hand side, you can see that what they've done is take and aggregate the losses and fines associated with misconduct and non-compliance and so on. So we can see that by the time we get to 2017, we're up at around $320 billion, which is quite an extraordinary sum when you stop and think about it. And, and then if you move over,
pay for an awful lot of Brexit.
And then if you move over to the right-hand side, you can see the right side of the graphic. and Andrew and I were joking about this earlier on. The European regulators need to get their act together, because they've only managed to collect about 20 billion of those fines, whereas the US regulators, the DOJ and various other agencies of the US government, managed to collect 180 billion of that. So 200 billion has been paid out by the banks directly to regulatory agencies and what have you, and the remaining bit was paid out to customers. So it is a very sizable problem, this notion of financial misconduct. And of course, if we move, say, to the next slide, I thought we'd just have a quick look at this one. Deutsche Bank had to actually send out a letter sometime last year, signed by the CEO, or the former CEO, John Cryan, in which they apologized to their stakeholders, their customers, and I assume they're also apologizing to their shareholders for the fact that they managed to incur some pretty sizable losses and fines associated with their own misconduct, everything from mis-selling these mortgage-backed securities to various other activities which are mentioned in that letter from on the right-hand side from the CEO. And then if we now another kind of facet of financial misconduct, which isn't really something that's obviously not really a result of the financial crisis and the mis-selling of derivatives and so on. If we look at there are many examples, Andrew mentioned one already, which was Nick Leeson, who managed to bankrupt Barings Bank. But if we look at this one, this I believe is the largest single lot rogue trading incident that's been experienced. So the gentleman whose picture you see on the screen, Jérôme Kefil, was a trader at Société Générale in France, and he managed to lose. I'll just quickly summarize what the key issues were. He managed to lose for the bank somewhere in the region of 7.5 billion euros, I believe. And what's interesting about this case, and I know a little bit about it because I've actually had the opportunity to talk to somebody who was associated with him when this was going on. What's interesting about this case is that this gentleman started out in the back office functions in the bank, and he became very, very familiar with how the back office systems work. He had access to all the he had passwords and access to all these systems and so on. He eventually was then promoted and given a trading book to look after. And what he did basically was run up these extraordinarily high losses, but was able to hide them from the bank as a result of his knowledge about the back office systems. And it's even reported that he was able to accomplish this because some of the passwords that had been in effect when he was just as I say, a back office guy, were still in effect years later after he was now a trader. So this is an extraordinary example of how even a simple thing like, ensuring that passwords are changed regularly and that other security protocols are being updated and so on might have avoided this particular loss, this rather substantial loss of 7+ billion euros. I'll let Andrew, you can handle maybe the next one.
Yeah, sure. Now, I mean, as Clive has said, this sort of speaks to some of the ways that we might mitigate operational risk. And in reality, I'll make no apologies in saying that a lot of these things are actually very simple and very straightforward. So I wouldn't want people to run away with the idea that somehow that there is amazingly complicated processes or techniques to manage operational risk. I dare say there are some if you look in the corners, but essentially a lot of operational risk management is actually quite simple. It's about applying simple principles and rules, may I say it, rigorously and fully, to make sure that the basic controls are actually in place. And as Clive has done on this slide here, he's actually broken it out into two areas, internal controls and external controls. And obviously internal controls are about the ones that are applied inside the institution. And, these are the classic examples of standard internal controls. They are, for example, separation of function, so that individuals involved in actually committing the firm to a deal are not the same people who actually handle the clearing and accounting and payments for that deal. You have dual entries, so that there are two different sources of information that are being keyed about a particular deal or trade. So again, that they can be reconciled later to make sure that there hasn't been an error, for example, in one of the keyings. There's a reconciliation of the outputs from different sources. So between the trader's estimate, for instance, of P&Ls versus the middle office's estimates of P&Ls.
If I could just interject for a moment, there's quite an interesting case study here too on this issue that Andrew just covered. Some of you may well have encountered the big problem that JP Morgan faced about 5-6 years ago now, known as the London whale trade, where the traders, based here in London actually, who were trading various credit index derivatives and what have you,
CDS,
managed to lose over $6 billion. And this loss was eventually investigated by the various regulators in the US, including the US Senate. US Senate conducted an inquiry into this. And one of the interesting things that came out as a result of this loss was that the traders in London were submitting marks. They were marking the book, the derivatives book, to the market, but they were not following best practice, i.e. maybe, for example, on a illiquid of a day when no trading had taken place, they weren't following the best practice, which is the idea of a midpoint mark. They were using marks that essentially minimize the losses. So the important point really here was that it wasn't as if they were necessarily engaging in misrepresentation, because the key idea was that the people in New York to whom they were reporting these numbers every night never got round to checking them. So his example exactly of what we were just saying, which is that simple things like, in order to make sure that this type of event doesn't happen, you need to double check everything. You can't just take the word of the traders, because the traders are obviously perhaps looking to try to minimize the position that they were in at the time. So even something as fundamental as just double checking and making sure that the marks corresponded, people in New York should have done that to ensure that they were actually seeing accurate marks.
And also, a double checking from the same source, of course, isn't a double check. So if two people look at the same number, that's not a check at all. And, many institutions are guilty of that, I think, of using the same external source for data and then using two people to check it and then calling that a verification process, which, of course, it's not. And I mean, I think an old friend of mine once summed it up, that the roots of a lot of these problems is the firm doesn't know what it owes, it doesn't know what it does owe, at any time, and it doesn't know the value of what it's owed or what it might owe in the future. And any kind of error or mistake over that means that you don't understand your risk. And if you don't understand your risk, then that's a recipe for mishandling it in the future and losing out as a result of it. So again, just to reiterate it, a lot of these processes really are bread and butter stuff about making sure that the core things are actually done properly. If we think about external controls, so these are things that we're doing with the outside. Things like confirmations, which is really just checking with a counterparty that they agree that what the details of the trade is are what we booked, and authorizations in terms of people who are allowed to actually do transactions and whether those transactions are within the scope that's permitted. So that's all to do with the mandate, if you like, the risk mandate and the risk appetite of the firm. And the settlement processes, again, which are about payments against delivery. They're the right currencies, the right accounts, the right dates, the right security codes. All of those things are really bread and butter, really, to operational risk. And a lot of the mistakes that occur down at that level, keying in the wrong code for something, or entering the wrong amount, or any other of those factors. One of the things, again, that this sort of leads into, which I think Clive is going to be able to talk a little bit more, is about corporate governance. A lot of the problems stem from the fact that although firms have, in theory, these sorts of processes in place, and people are educated or trained, if you like, to some degree to follow the rules. If the tone from the top, if the boss basically doesn't believe in it, then you can have a situation where firms become lackadaisical. I mean, I can give a sort of pseudo-real example of this. The classic example is things like Chinese walls or entries passes, for example. I remember in a couple of firms that I've worked in one firm, if the managing director came down to the trading floor and the door was closed and he didn't have his pass, what he would do is hammer on the door and force the guy who was inside to let him in. Because he didn't have his pass and he wasn't going to go back to his office for the pass. And of course, the guy who let him never questioned for 1 minute who he was, so he gave him access without him having the correct pass. Through to other organisations, which basically, even if you're the managing director, I'm not letting you in unless you go and get your pass, because effectively the rules say nobody gets access without having proper authorisation. So, you can tell to some extent the kind of level of corporate governance and commitment of a firm, basically by the way the guys at the top behave.
Yeah, as Andrew said, we've got a slide coming up in a moment, which I want to come to in a moment. But I actually teach courses on operational risk to various banks around the world, and there is actually increasing demand from people in banking to get a better handle on ways of addressing some of the things we've been talking about. These massive fines and losses we've been talking about so far. And one of the key ideas is that banks have got to somehow improve their risk culture. The regulators are even insisting on it. If you look at some of the Basel language in the Basel rules and so on, they're actually now making this a requirement. And if you talk to people working in supervision in central banks today, they are very keen on the idea of not just kind of looking at all the various kind of quantitative tests and box ticking that banks need to do, but they were looking at try to understand the culture of a bank. And that, sometimes, it's somewhat easy to be cynical about this and say, well, what does the risk culture really mean? And, there are ways of spelling it out. I mean, we touched briefly on corporate governance, improving internal risk control processes. You need to have a very active and vigilant internal audit team within the bank. There are issues to do, for example, with even whether or not a bank should rely on the same firm of external auditors for year after year, and I believe that is now in the process of changing. At least in the UK, it is. I believe it is elsewhere in the world. So there are a number of ways that banks can, in addition to just having better systems for monitoring risk, start to think about this notion of risk culture. So what do we actually mean by risk culture? So let's take the Basel Committee, in one of their documents, said the definition they offered: the combined set of individual and corporate values, attitudes, competencies, and behaviour that determine a firm's commitment to and style of operational risk management. So it's a kind of another layer that is part of the organisation. We often think about risk management as sort of a set of procedures and a set of kind of rules and with which one has to comply, but it goes beyond that. It goes to the kind of the ethos, the set of values within the company, either the bank or the other business, any other business for that matter. And as I say, this is becoming much more of a focus from the regulatory community. I like the definition from the one at the bottom, the Institute of International Finance. The development of a risk culture throughout a firm is perhaps the most fundamental tool for effective risk management. So just to try maybe to flesh out a little bit more the notion of what a risk culture, or what the culture of a company might be, this diagram, which I found in an organizational theory book, which I like a lot, basically, we don't have time to cover in any real detail, but if I might just sort of point to the lowest layer of that pyramid there. Well, maybe I'll start at the top, but you've got various what you might call the physical layer, which is sort of business process, tools, structures, and so on. Then as you move down, you move through infrastructure, behavior. On the cultural level, this is the deeply held assumptions, values, beliefs, norms within a company. Now, if you look at the two axes on the left and right to that, the one on the left basically says that as you move down the pyramid from the top, the most difficult layer to change, of course, is the one at the bottom. It's relatively easy for a company, say, to change the configuration of its offices or change some relatively simple business process. Where it's much more difficult to dig down and address issues to do with values, beliefs, norms, and so on. But on the right axis, the benefit, of course, is that the changes, if to the extent that you can make these changes at that layer, they will be the most enduring. They will have the most persistence. So it really is a matter, and this is why changing a risk culture is not something you achieve in a matter of weeks or months. It's something that needs to be undertaken and achieved over a number of years. And I think it's fair to say that the banks now are recognizing that challenge. They're being asked to do this by their regulators and by some of the more, I might just mention somebody who I believe is really on the case in this respect is the current governor of the Bank of England here in the UK, Mark Carney, who's a very distinguished banker and also heads up the Financial Stability Board in Switzerland. But he's a strong advocate of this and has written a number of given speeches, written a number of papers on this topic. So the idea is to try as much as possible, in addition to improving risk management from a process point of view, to think about trying to make these changes in the overall deep cultural level of an organization.
And I'm on that note, I'm reminded of a little story which is hopefully going to amplify that point. Where long ago I went to visit Cape Canaveral, where they launched the rockets from with NASA, and entered the washroom, the bathroom, restroom, as they would call it over there. And there's a guy sweeping the floor, and I wander over to him, make conversation, say to him, "Oh, how you doing, fella? What are you up to?" And what he said to me was he was helping to put a man on the moon.
Ah.
So in terms of culture, even if the guy in the restroom sees that actually his job is part of the task of actually putting the man on the moon, not just sweeping the floor, then I would say that NASA had a good culture.
Exactly right.
That's an example of how the culture actually pervades the whole organisation from the top to the bottom.
That's a good example, Andrew, because you see, I mean, I think we even have a question that's come up on this topic to do with, how will one go about, for example, improving risk culture? And I mean, Andrew's example is a good one because, when you get better engagement from all the people in an organisation, and we've been talking a lot about banking here, but we could just as easily talk about other businesses as well. But when you get better engagement from all the stakeholders, all the people involved, the employees from top to bottom in an organisation, and they start to take on this kind of notion that they own the culture and they should improve it, then I think it takes time, but eventually you begin to create an environment in which you're less likely to see some of the things that we've been talking about earlier on. You're less likely to see the kind of, for example, the JP Morgan situation, or even the rogue trading elements and so on, or mis-selling of derivatives, money laundering, mis-selling of PPI, to take another example, which we could have talked about in this webinar. Here in the UK, something like $40 billion or pounds has been paid out by banks as a result of mis-selling of PPI.
Yeah, a massive amount of money over something that should never have happened. I mean, in situations where effectively banks knowingly sold insurance to people, knowing that they could never claim. So again, in essence, was something that people knew was fraudulent at the time, and clearly should never have happened. Anybody with a conscience, anybody with the right culture, should have been incapable of actually doing such a thing. That's great. Thank you, Clive.
Okay.
Go ahead,
yeah. Another one of the questions, thank you both, was how can banks try to reduce the amount they pay in fine and their sanctions?
Well, interestingly, that may not be necessarily the right way to think about this. I mean, we touched on this earlier, but the US regulator, the DOJ, for example, is taken a very aggressive stance towards the levying of fines for misconduct. I mean, Andrew mentioned the example there was one example, of course, where I think the Standard Chartered was dealing with the banks that were on this blacklist.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, there's an even bigger case which is just coming to my mind right now, and this does involve Banco Paribas. Paribas did something similar to what Andrew was talking about earlier on, which was that their US office, their EU-based office for Paribas, was reprimanded a couple of times by the DOJ for continuing to deal with account holders that were located in one of the territories is on the blacklist, which is either Iran, Korea, North Korea, Sudan, and what have you. I believe it was Iran.
It was Iran.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they persisted. They did this once. They were told off. They did it a second time. They were told off. And eventually the DOJ said, okay, well, you don't seem to be listening to us, so maybe a $10 billion fine might help you to sort of pay attention to what we're saying. So I understand the point of the question. I mean, you know, I guess the sort of glib answer would be, best way to avoid the fines is not to engage in the misconduct.
Yeah. And of course, this is politically sensitive because, you know, you have a situation where perhaps in Europe the view is that they'd rather engage with Iran and have Iran basically as a trading partner and therefore move forward on that basis, whereas the Americans, certainly under Donald Trump, have taken a harder line with Iran. But of course, what you have to remember is ultimately in the world of banking and money, you know, everybody's equal except the Americans. Of course, America is more equal than everywhere else. The US dollar is the world's currency. And if you want to deal in US dollars in any shape or form in any place in the world, ultimately you'll answer to the Americans. So it's very difficult to see how any bank of any size could engage in dollar transactions, for example, where you was actually, you know, breaking sanctions anywhere in the world. So it didn't really matter whether the payments were coming out of a US entity or not. If you're involved in dollars, and you're also involved in doing something that the Americans don't like, then you are in trouble because certainly, you know, they are fully capable and I believe would block your ability to deal in dollars, for example, and that could cause obviously a massive problem for any major organisation. You know, the world in many senses, particularly in finance, is global. And who you deal with and what you deal in basically is the subject of scrutiny across the planet. And particularly, as Clive has said, you know, our American cousins are, you know, pretty hot on these things, and they don't mind levying extremely large fines if they don't think that they're actually getting their way. So I think the answer to the question is basically don't do the crime if you can't do the time.
That's right. And I think, you know, I think the attitude that perhaps, you know, the American regulators have come up with or have decided to follow is, you know, if it doesn't hurt the bank, then, you know, it doesn't really serve much purpose, does it? I mean, you know, levying a fine of, you know, a couple of $100 million to a bank that's you know, has revenues and earnings that are in the billions, it's just a minor irritant. Whereas
it's a cost of doing business. They regard it as a cost of doing business.
You know, you levy a $13 billion fine, which was the one we talked about with JP Morgan, or the $10 billion that we just talked about with Banque Paribas. And, you know, that hurts. That's something that shows up on the quarterly P&L, and that's something that the shareholders and the stakeholders are not going to be happy to see. So I think the idea is that if it doesn't hurt, then I guess the regulators haven't really done their job. But as Andrew just said, and I mentioned myself, hopefully eventually, as a result of some of the things we've been talking about, improvements in risk culture and all of that, it may be that the banks will avoid getting themselves into the trouble which creates these fines.
And I actually think, I mean, again, naming no names, no pack drill, there are certainly institutions that have knowingly done these things. It isn't that they've made a mistake or they've been unaware. They've taken a calculated risk that basically that the upside would beat the downside. And these aren't mistakes. This is basically a tactical thing. And I think, you know, the DOJ and other US regulators are responding in kind. You know, you've underestimated us, guys, in terms of what this would cost. And I think that's the attitude really to understand. I don't think these were mistakes.
No. All right. Well, hopefully that's been enjoyable and entertaining for some, or it's interesting. So thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Clive and Andrew, and everyone for listening. As mentioned earlier, we'll send the full recording along with the slides in a few days. And for more information about our training programs, please visit iff-training.com. See you soon.
Good stuff.